Oh my goodness. I have to confess I'm a little bit overwhelmed right now. And the reason for that is it is astonishing to me that there actually exists a society that takes the idea of being a Christian and the idea of being an artist and brings them together as something that matters. I was working as a journalist in the contemporary Christian music field. I was doing some work for a magazine called Music Line back in the 80s. Anybody know Music Line? Anybody remember the 80s? I was doing work as a journalist in the contemporary Christian music scene when Amy Grant did what they called her big crossover, right? And everyone was so appalled that the idea of the word baby showed up more often than the name of Jesus in one of her new albums. And this was very controversial where I came from. And I think about that idea that we, as a community of faith in that season, forced people like Amy Grant to decide, are you going to love your craft? Are you going to pursue the way that God made you, the way that music catalyzes everything that's good about creation and God, or are you going to be in the church in the worship band leading? Right? It's that decision that we've had to make, and the idea that a society exists for the purpose of bringing those two halves, those two passions together as one, the wholeness that can flow from that, the blessing that can emanate as we're freed up to be who we really are in Christ as artists. Yeah? Wow. Thank you for letting me come and talk with you today. Thank you, Brian and Michelle, for your heroic work in pulling something like this together, to Holy Trinity for sponsoring this event, for the warmth of your welcome here. It means a lot. Thank you so very much. Thank you to all the members and patrons of the St. Anselm Society. Keep doing what you're doing. May your number increase, not just here, but may you multiply across the globe. The work that you're doing is so needed. It is so desperately needed. There are people like me who will be beside themselves to think that these two impulses so close to our heart can be joined together in this way. I want to thank Lancia and Peter for all of the practical and magical things that you do to make it possible for me to do what I do. So thank you. Thank you very, very much. And thanks for a chance to talk about two of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. When we think of Lewis and Tolkien, we tend to think of them as truly extraordinary individuals, right? We think of them as creative geniuses, somehow other, right, from ourselves. And there's a way in which that's true. That's a good way to think about it. Both men were enormously gifted. They were gifted with imagination, and they were gifted with intellect. They were talented writers, and both were visual artists. Did you know that? Tolkien is an incredibly good watercolor artist. His paintings are beautiful. He really excelled at it. Both Lewis and Tolkien grew up in homes surrounded by books and reading. They both received a first-rate education. Both men were also gifted with a deep and abiding faith in Christ. They were extraordinary men, and they were given extraordinary opportunities. But the more I study their lives and consider their creative process, the more it strikes me how very ordinary they seem to be. Yeah, they had talent. Yeah, they had genius. Oh, absolutely. But how does talent get actualized, right? What catalyzes it? What takes innate ability and tremendous opportunity and brings them in such a place that they produce great works like the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, on and on. And in our own lives, how do our dreams and our creative abilities get translated into books, songs, sermons, blogs, businesses, and breakthroughs that cause us to feel fully alive and that do the world a world of good? How does that happen? how do we take our ability and our opportunities and how do we turn that into a daily lifestyle that's productive and sustainable with results that are durable? How do we innovate in such a way that our work is worth it? Yeah? And that the result is something that lasts. In order to answer these questions, it helps, I think, to first address some misconceptions that we have about creativity, about the nature of creativity and the exercise of it. And then I think it helps to learn what we can from a couple of Oxford dons who are really, really good at this. So here we go. There's a tendency to think of creative geniuses as people who are eccentric, totally different from the rest of us. When I was a kid, this is absolutely true. When I was a kid, I literally believed that I could never become an author. Never. And the reason for that is I thought authors were people who were raised on a mountain top. And can you picture it, kind of a Greek temple, right? Where they were fed a special food, where they sat around all day thinking the great thoughts, until a lightning bolt of inspiration struck them, and then they would run to their canvas or paper with one of those feather pens, right? And that it would all rush out from the end of their pen in perfect order right the first time under the strike of imagination, right? So I had this idea that that was how it worked. That's the Hollywood image. That's part of our collective mythology. But if you spend time studying the creative process and the way that talent and genius actually work, the real story looks quite different from that, doesn't it? You're creative artists, you understand the long hours, the lonely nights, the years that are spent perfecting your craft, the hard time pressing through when discouragement crashes in. You understand how very ordinary the exercise of those gifts can be. It's hard work, it's persistence, it's small steps. To put it another way, here's how I think about it. Creative inspiration has a kind of magic to it, but it's a magic that tends to work itself out in surprisingly ordinary, everyday kind of ways. Take Lewis and Tolkien, for example. Both men had full-time jobs. They were not raised on a mountaintop. They were teachers. They were teachers at Oxford. Teachers are here, teachers. Yeah. They spent all day, every day going to meetings, working with students, preparing lectures and grading papers. Both men struggled financially. They took on extra work, part-time jobs to make ends meet. They were active in their church life. They were devoted to ministry. They served in their communities. They had daily responsibilities. C.S. Lewis had to pay the bills, take care of his household, spend time with the family. Does this sound at all familiar? Lewis and Tolkien had heavy workloads. Not only that, they had part-time work on the side to pay the bills. They had competing demands in their neighborhoods, their churches, and their home lives. And yet, Lewis and Tolkien managed to write some of the most important, most original, most inspiring, and most enduring books of the past century. Yeah. How'd they do that? How did they do that? How do busy people like us with mortgages accomplish extraordinary things? What does it take to turn the delight of inspiration into a finished published book, into a poem that you read at a poetry reading, into a beautiful photograph that you take of a flower that smiles back at you? How does that all happen? How did they do that, and how do we? These questions fascinate me. And I've been studying them for years and talking to students about them, and I'm so excited to talk about them with you because the story of Lewis and Tolkien and their creative collaboration is so interesting and so instructive for us. Their example teaches us so much about how we can become more productive and more successful, no matter what our gifts or callings may be. So let's start by taking a look at C.S. Lewis. As you know, Lewis grew up in Northern Ireland, not too far from Belfast. He grew up in a house that was stuffed full of books. In describing his childhood, Lewis wrote this: "I am the product of endless books. My father bought all the books he read, and he never got rid of any of them." There were books in the study, books in the drawing room, books too deep in the great bookcase on the landing. There were books that were suitable for a child, and books most emphatically not. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves, and I had always the same certainty of finding a book that was new to me, as a man who walks in a field has of finding a new blade of grass. Now there's a house to grow up in, yeah? Lewis's early favorites included the novels of E. Nesbit and classics like Gulliver's Travels and Wind in the Willows. But he had a particular love. His imagination was kindled in a particular way by mythology, particularly Norse mythology. Now, when we think about ancient mythology, most of us think about Greek and Roman myths. We think about Zeus and Athena, Apollo and Poseidon. But Lewis was drawn to names like Thor and Odin and Balder the Beautiful. Growing up in a household surrounded by books, it is not surprising that he began to write stories when he was just a very small boy. And he illustrated them with pictures, and he drew elaborate maps. His early creative life was shared by his older brother, Warren Lewis. And I think it is not inconsequential that his earliest creative experiments were in collaboration, working together with his brother 3 years older than he. Together they created an imaginary world they called Boxen, and it was peopled with talking animals. And it had a lot of stuff in it about steamships and ships and railroads and trade routes to India. India was their favorite place. So Lewis did a great deal of writing as a child, stories, essays. He even wrote several short plays when he was little. He published his first poem in the school newspaper at the age of 14. And 6 years later, he published his first book. It was a book of poetry, and its title was Spirits in Bondage. 7 years later, he published his second book, another book of poetry. It was a narrative poem called Dimer. But while these first two books were admired by the critics, they did not do well. And his early dreams of becoming a writer did not seem to be getting any closer. But the entire trajectory of his life changed shortly after he began his first job. So you have to picture Lewis at his very, very first job. He had trouble getting that job, by the way. He was out of work for almost 2 years after he graduated. He had trouble finding a job, but finally he did find a position teaching literature at Oxford. And at a faculty meeting in that very first year, he met John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. Now, as you may know, well, their first meeting wasn't exactly promising. Now, Tolkien was so unimpressed with meeting Mr. C.S. Lewis that he doesn't mention it anywhere. Not in any of his diaries, not in any of his letters, not in any of his lectures, not in any of his reminiscence. There's no record from Tolkien's point of view of meeting Lewis for the first time. It was a non-event. Lewis, however, does record this first meeting in a letter to a friend where he says, and I quote, "Tolkien is a pale, fluent little fellow. He's basically harmless, just needs a good smack." Why the hostility? Fundamentally, Lewis and Tolkien were very, very different sorts of people. At that first meeting, the whole faculty at Oxford was engaged in a big fight And if you want to see a big fight, you should see faculty members fighting. They were fighting about which books should be required for undergraduates in their program. And it turns out that Lewis and Tolkien were on opposite sides of the fight, right from the beginning. Lewis was a literature and philosophy guy. Tolkien was a linguist by training and disposition. And initially their conflicts arose from their very, very different academic backgrounds. Because as you know, an academic background is not just a body of things that you study. It really is a whole world view. A linguist looks at life differently from someone whose love is literature. It's a different lens, a different way really of making sense of the world. There were other deep differences between besides the academic. Lewis was an atheist at this point in time, while Tolkien was a committed Catholic who worried all of his life about the health of Lewis's soul. Lewis was a big man with a loud voice, quick wit, hearty laugh, and a talent for friendship, while Tolkien was the opposite. You might say he was more finely tuned. He was thoughtful, he was sensitive, he was very gentle and soft-spoken. So, to be honest, things were pretty tense from the beginning. And there were lots of reasons for them not to get along, but then something happened. You see, Lewis and Tolkien became members of a club on campus, a club called the Coal Biters. Now, the Coal Biters was an interesting club. It was not a club I would have joined, but maybe you would love it. It was a club that existed to read old Icelandic myths in Old Norse. And then translate them aloud around the circle spontaneously. They actually found somebody bringing a crib sheet one week and they tossed him out. They wouldn't let him back. Now, Old Norse mythology may not be your cup of tea, but I bet you understand the impulse, don't you? When people love the same books, it's really easy to make a connection. C.S. Lewis later in his life would write a book called The Four Loves, and in that book he makes a distinction between lovers and friends. He says lovers spend their energy and their attention looking at one another, but friends become friends because they're looking together in the same direction, side by side. And it's looking together, looking at books that brought Lewis and Tolkien together in a way that nothing else could have. It forged a connection, and they became fast friends. Now this group, the Coal Biters, that group disbanded, but Lewis and Tolkien wanted to keep in touch. They wanted to stay connected. So they made a decision to meet every Monday morning for conversation and lunch. It was such a simple thing. I want you to really think about how simple this is so simple, right? Lunch, two guys, and conversation. Free-ranging conversation wherever their fancy might take them. Conversations as fresh and far-ranging as you can imagine, everyone sure to end in the discovery of a new blade of grass. Yeah? Two guys, just lunch, just conversation, such a simple thing, but Lewis later remarked that this meeting time became the pleasantest hour of the entire week. Now, after they'd been meeting for a while, Tolkien took a huge risk. I honestly believe that his courage, Tolkien's courage, became the turning point in terms of their career. So picture Tolkien sitting there with Lewis in the restaurant at the Eastgate Hotel on a busy street in Oxford. Tolkien's a little tired on that Monday morning. Why? Because he'd spent the better part of the weekend working on a long narrative poem that he was writing. It's a poem he'd been working on for years. It's a poem called The Lay of Lathian. It's an absolutely beautiful story. It tells the story of a romance between a man named Beren and a beautiful elf, and her name is Luthien Tinuviel. It is the most beautiful and the most personal of all of Tolkien's created work. Can I read you just a little bit of this poem? I love this poem. If we had a really long time, I'd just read the whole thing, but it's, yeah. Okay, so here's just a little piece of it. The leaves were long, the grass was green, The hemlock umbels tall and fair, and in the glade a light was seen of stars and shadow shimmering. Tenuviel was dancing there, to music of a pipe unseen. The light of stars was in her hair, and in her raiment glimmering. Isn't that neat? What's really neat about this poem and this piece of the poem is that Tolkien is in fact describing an event that happened during his courtship of his wife Edith, when she undid her hair and danced in a glade with the starlight glimmering. It is one of the most beautiful and certainly the most personal of all of Tolkien's work. And in fact, when you go to Oxford, I want you to visit the cemetery where Tolkien and his wife Edith are buried, and you will see that right on their tombstones is carved Baron and Luthien, because he's so strongly identified with these characters and this beautiful story. I love that poem. And I love it that it's that particular poem that was the first poem that Tolkien shared with his friend Lewis. The whole thing is based on his own love story. He'd been working on it for years, and in December of 1929, he spent a very busy weekend working on it some more. Monday morning comes and there's Tolkien getting ready for his regularly scheduled time with Lewis. It's raining. England, it's always raining. And as Tolkien grabs his raincoat and his umbrella, he notices the stack of manuscript papers sitting there on a chair not far from the door. And by some kind of magical coincidence or holy prompting, he grabs those pages, he stuffs them in his satchel, he takes a deep breath, and out the door he goes. Lewis and Tolkien meet, just like always. They eat lunch, just like always. Maybe drink a beer, just like always. And as things are wrapping up, Tolkien stands, pulls on his coat, picks up his satchel, notices the manuscript pages. And he turns back to Lewis and he says, so Lewis, I've been working on a poem. Would you like to read it? Lewis is thrilled. He takes the manuscript pages home and he reads the poem that night. And he loves it. He writes a quick note. This note is about half a page long. And it says, in part, I can quite honestly say that it is ages since I have had an evening of such delight. Whew. This little note is full of praise for Tolkien's poem, but Lewis ends his note this way. He says, quote, detailed criticisms, including grumbles about individual lines, will follow, period. That's a rather ominous way to end a letter. So that's the note he writes that first night. About 2 weeks later, that second letter arrives with the detailed criticisms and the miscellaneous grumbles. We still have that letter. I've seen it. It's single-spaced and 14 pages long. Yeah. Lewis grumbles and Lewis complains. He corrects and he advises. And he even completely rewrites several sections of the poem. Yes, he does. Yeah, he does. So here's what I love about this story. Tolkien likes the second letter much more than he likes the first. Because the first letter means he found a fan. But the second letter means he found a resonator. A resonator. He found someone who fundamentally understood what he was attempting. He found somebody who devoted his best attention and the fullness of his best talents to looking carefully, line by line, at the work that Tolkien was undertaking. Tolkien was thrilled. It's great to have a fan, but a resonator is really something special. So I think about us. What is the first thing we need if we're going to really grow in terms of the use of our own talents and opportunities? And I think one of the things we really need are resonators. Now here's the thing. We talk a lot, especially as Christian artists, about needing support, right? We use the word support. I need support. I appreciate your support. Thank you for your support. Support is not the same as resonators. Yeah? Because, well, let me explain it to you this way. I get a lot of support from my mom. Right? No, come on, I love my mom. And my mom loves me, right? My mom believes in my dreams. Doesn't know what they are, but she believes in me. And the whole 23 years that I was working on the company they keep, she would call and she'd say, honey, how's the little book coming? And I'd say, great, Mom. And she'd say, good. Right? I love having support and people who praise the work that I do, but a resonator is somebody who fundamentally gets what it is that you're doing. It's why we need each other as Christian artists. I'm part of a small group. It's not quite like the Inklings, but it is a group that gets together faithfully, a Christian Artists Prayer Fellowship that I'm the pastor of. And people in that group understand what it's like to come to the group on a Saturday night having gotten my 43rd rejection letter. They get it. They don't say, buck up, it's going to be fine. They say, man, that's hard. That hurts. I'm sorry. Yeah? We need people who are resonators. Now, my friend, Gain Anaker, when I was talking about resonators at one event, he explained it to me this way. When you think of a resonator, you should think of a stringed instrument, like a piano. Now, I am not a musician. I apologize to all of the musicians right up front. But this is the way my friend Gain explained it to me. That if you take something like a piano, that the little strings, they actually don't make a whole lot of noise. Now, they may make a beautiful tone, and they may make a pure tone. But if anybody else is going to get in on it, then you need a resonator, which is the back of the piano, which vibrates at the same frequency and amplifies and enriches the sound of that string. Violins, I guess, guitars, it's the body of the instrument that picks up the note and carries it forward. That's what resonators do. That's what we need from one another as resonators. Otherwise, that little sound won't go very far. It will not be enriched. It will not go forward. We need resonators. My friend Hillary talks about being a teacher, and she talks about being a resonator for her students. Taking their little ideas, vibrating at the same frequency, amplifying the goodness in the notes that she hears, and then bouncing it back to them and then forward to a larger audience. It's a great way to think about the work that we do. When I think about resonators, for me the quintessential example is my friend Joe. I remember when I was working on that book, The Company They Keep, that big old purple book. And I remember coming to my Saturday night prayer group after yet another rejection letter. And I remember coming into the room and I was just as low can be. And I said to them, I'm just so done. I'm just so done with this. I just can't do this anymore. I got nothing. I got nothing. I'm finished. It was a grand attempt. It was a super idea. There's just never going to be a book out of this. My friend Joe said, Diana, I can see this. He said, I can see you walking through that door with a box full of books. I can see it. And I said, Joe, I can't see it. I cannot see that ever happening. And he said, that's okay. I'll see it for you until you can see it for yourself. That's what a resonator does, right? They hold the dream and keep it alive when we have lost the energy and the ability to move forward and keep going. Joe is a writer. He's the author of 8 books. He gets it. He's been there. He knows the dark night of the soul. In essence, resonators are people who understand bone deep what it is you're trying to do. They keep the vision. They hold it for you when you can't see it and you can't find it. Now, they fill many different roles. Practically speaking, resonators show interest. They give feedback. They ask good questions. They check in with you. How are you doing? They contribute practical help. They also help to promote the work to others, to help others complete that transactional process of the creative role. When Lewis took the time to write 14 single-spaced pages about Tolkien's poem, he showed that he was a resonator, someone who understood and valued what Tolkien was attempting. This idea of creativity in community involves learning to be better at being resonators for each other. And it's a learning process. We need to learn how to do that. We need to learn how to support or help one another, resonate for one another. We also need to learn how to be better at receiving that. We need to get better at asking for what we need. We need to get better at developing a vocabulary for what it is that we're up to. Because for me, for example, there's a huge difference at the very beginning of a project when I go up to a friend and I say, was thinking I might possibly go to Colorado and give a talk. And I need that friend who goes, yeah, I think you got that. Yeah, I think you could do that, right? So, there's a big difference at that baby beginning idea stage and the stage where I say, Hillary, this manuscript is a mess, but I don't know what to try. Help, right? When I need something that might be a little bit more bold, a little bit more forward, a little bit more difficult, right, to hear. Because we need resonators, but we also need agitators. Yeah? Those 2 letters that Lewis wrote to Tolkien, the 2 letters that gave him feedback about that poem, they show us that we need agitators. Because what Lewis said in essence was this: Tolkien, that poem is good. It's really good. But it isn't good enough. You can do much better. And that's what an agitator does. It's a both and kind of thing. We need resonators. It's good. It's worth it. You're on track. You got this. And let's bring it up to the next level. Let's hone your craft. Let's make it better than it would be with you talking in the living room to your dog about these ideas. Now, at the beginning of my book, Bandersnatch, I tell the story of my mentor. I tell the story of how he tried to talk me out of writing a book about the Inklings. The fact is, the details of that group and how they functioned, they didn't keep minutes. There's no systematic record of what they did. All the information that we have about those meetings of that group are tucked away in diaries and manuscripts and handwritten letters, and those are scattered in archives across the globe. And my mentor was convinced that if I were to start as a beginning scholar to take on as my very first project, trying to gather together all of those scraps and knit it together into a comprehensive story that I would be throwing my career away. So he said, give it up. Don't even start. He said to me, you are too good to throw away every possibility of a productive life. Don't do it. So, that was nearly 40 years ago. And I am deeply grateful that he was an agitator. Because after I was finished crying, it took me about 2 weeks, I had to dig down really deep and figure out, do I want this? Is this just a hobby? Is this just a fly-by-night idea? Is this just a little thing? Or is this a big deal to me? Is this, in fact, a holy calling? And if he hadn't challenged me right at the beginning to dig deep and to think about what was God doing with my work, my life, my time, my talents, I think I would have washed out when it got tough, because it was hard. And 23 years is a long time to work on a book. But he helped me right at the beginning to develop the deep roots, the resilience, the determination to follow those scraps and to tell their story the very best I knew how. Can I tell you real quick one more story about an agitator in my life? This was about 4 years ago. I was teaching a class on the Inklings, and one of the books that we used in that class is The Company They Keep. And after class, I had a student, little 18-year-old student come up to me after class, and she said to me, "Professor, you wrote The Company They Keep as if you care about every last single detail of the lives of these men." And I said, "Why, yes, I did." And she looked me in the eye and she said, "Not everyone does." Well, this was a revelation. So I went home and I thought, not everyone does? Really? And then I started to wonder, is it possible that I could tell the story of the Inklings and their creative interaction in such a way that the stories would come forward and the meaning would be clear? And not only that, I could underscore in some particular way what the lessons are in very practical terms that we learn from this group of men. And so Bandersnatch was a book that was written specifically in response to a question or comment from an undergraduate at Azusa Pacific University. She was an agitator. Before that, it never occurred to me that we needed another book. Spent a lot of time on the other one, so I thought we were done now. But the Holy Spirit and some great research assistance and a few years of work on Bandersnatch and then some wonderful collaboration with my friend James Owen to do those gorgeous illustrations in that book. And I'm really excited about that particular project. The thing about agitators, besides the fact that they're hard, it's hard to deal with them sometimes, it's hard to manage the balance, right? Is that a really good agitator is almost always someone who's fundamentally very different from we are. And if you think about it, that's very logical. You need someone who comes at it, who looks at things from a very different perspective. The two stories I told you, the story of my mentor, someone who is very seasoned in the profession, and the story of an 18-year-old student, someone who's just very much beginning her own scholarly career, these are people who look at things differently from the way that I look at them. And I guess can I use the word usefulness? Do you understand that in a good sense? Their usefulness to my own creative process is the direct result of the fact that they're very different. And so that's why I think it's so important that we don't just tolerate people who have different points of view, but that we go out of our way to cultivate conversation with people who have very different perspective from our own, and that we learn how to listen to those different perspectives without getting defensive about it. R.E. Havard, a member of the Inklings, said that it's the differences in the members of the group that laid the foundation for the friendship, which is really different from the way we usually think about it. We usually think about it as they became friends despite their differences, not they became friends because of those very, very deep differences. It was true of Lewis and Tolkien. It was also true of the other members of the group, people like Owen Barfield, Neville Coghill, and the irascible Hugo Dyson. The Inklings were by no means men of one trade. There was a lawyer who was a member of the group. There was a medical doctor. And Warren Lewis, he was a member of the group. He was lifelong military. Each one brought a wealth of different points of view, varying convictions, contrasting perspectives, and they spent Thursday night fighting, hammer and tongs, and it worked because iron sharpens iron. Charles Williams was a very important member of the Inklings. He puts it this way, quote, "No mind is so good that it does not need another mind to counter and equal it, to save it from conceit and blindness and bigotry and folly." So I've talked about resonators and we've talked about agitators, and I think that both of those important roles are suggested by the very first critique that Lewis offered of Tolkien's work. Lewis was a resonator who said in essence, what you're doing is really important. It matters. Don't quit, because there's more to be done. And if you understand these two impulses, the impulse of a resonator and the impulse of an agitator, you get a handle, I think, on what made the Inklings so successful and what it is we need more of in our collaborative communities. Lewis and Tolkien surrounded themselves with talented people who encouraged and challenged them. And one of my favorite scholars, Karen Burke Lefevre, gives this advice to creatives. She says, "Plant yourselves in a tall forest if you hope to have ideas of stature." Now, the balance of resonators and agitators is going to change in different seasons of our life. It's going to change in different stages of the life of a project. There are times when I need just tell me I'm okay, just tell me I'm on track. And there are times when I actually need someone to whop me upside the head and say, this is not okay, this is not working. Really, honestly, you need to do something different. This is a dead end, don't waste your time. The bigger picture, though, of trying to understand how these two impulses work together has to do with making a really important kind of switch in the way that we think about it. To take the bigger picture, we need to understand that we have sometimes offered one another praise of the product when what we actually needed were companions in the process. Can I say that again? Yeah. I think this is really the key. This is where we have to think differently. It's not just acquiring resonators and agitators, because what agitators and resonators are focused on is the product. Sometimes we offer feedback on the product, the end result. But what we really need are companions in the process of doing the hard things that God is always inviting us to try. C.S. Lewis was a resonator, and he was a good one. He was also an agitator, motivating Tolkien to try harder and do better. But it's their friendship, their companionship, working together side by side year after year that I think is the best explanation for the success of the work that they did. Their early writings were not great. Has anybody here actually read the Silmarillion? Silmarillion? Yeah. So if you think about, for those of you who are Tolkien folks, if you look at the difference between the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings, that's the difference between Tolkien left to his own devices and Tolkien when he has an audience nudging him along the way. Do you know what I'm talking about, those of you who understand how that works? The decision that Lewis and Tolkien made to start meeting for lunch was a very small beginning. It was the kind of thing any of us could do. Hey, that's an interesting idea. Let's have lunch, right? A small beginning, but it grew into something really big. After Tolkien first shared his poetry, remember that was in December of 1929, Lewis started bringing his own poetry to those Monday meetings. And Tolkien critiqued them, offering them praise, encouragement, correction, and suggestions. That pattern of sharing was so compelling to both men that they started to invite other people to join the group. One after another, Warren Lewis joined the group, Charles Williams did, Dr. Havard, Owen Barfield. 19 men eventually became members of that circle. They met twice a week for about 17 years, reading very rough and ragged drafts in process, inviting each other into the process, not just the finished, polished product, and helping each other out. They shared very rough drafts. They talked about writing, and they bounced ideas around to understand the ideas behind the work that they were doing. They revised their work radically in response to the feedback they received, and between them, the members of the Inklings published more than 150 books. That includes most of what Lewis wrote in his lifetime: Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, Screwtape Letters, Great Divorce, Hideous Strength, all of them read chapter to chapter, chapter by chapter, as they were written. And it's that as they were written bit that's really, really key, right? Because you come and you bring your stuff and you read a chapter and people go, oh, here's what I noticed and here's what I heard and here's what I like and wasn't so sure about that other part. It's not only the revision of what you've just shared, right? It's keeping you sort of on track for what you will write next. Yeah? Tolkien read The Lord of the Rings, every chapter, and very great changes were made in that book as a result. And I believe that the fingerprints of the Inklings are all over that epic story. There is so much great stuff that comes from the example of the Inklings, and a lot more we could talk about. The Inklings needed other things. They needed resonators and they needed agitators. They also needed role models. Just people to model for them. What does the life of a writer look like? Warren Lewis didn't think he could write a book. He started hanging out with the Inklings and he wrote 7 books of French history as a result of their influence. When Warren Lewis brought the first chapter of the first book he worked on to an Inklings meeting and read it out loud, Tolkien laughed and said, oh my goodness, it's catching. Right? This impulse to create is contagious. We need role models. I'm thankful every day for people like Sally Clarkson, who lives out her calling so beautifully. She's such a great role model for me. Her example constantly inspires me. We need role models. We need prayer. Oh my goodness, we need prayer. We need prayer and blessing over the work that we do. I have a faithful group of friends who pray. They prayed over me as I was writing this talk. They are praying over us tonight. They're praying over you. Without Lancia and Peter, without their prayers and love and ministry in my life, I could not do what I do. It's hard. It gets hard. The Inklings also needed anticipation. It's another thing that we need from one another. Anticipation. Just the idea that every Thursday night there would be a room full of people happy to see them and eager to listen to whatever they'd been working on. We use the word accountability to talk about how we kind of keep each other on track. I'm sure there isn't another procrastinator in this room except for myself. But accountability, like nobody wants to sign up for accountability. So I like the word expectation. I love to think that someone may be waiting with expectation for something that I may be working on. That audience becomes an important part of the work in really important ways. The audience, the reader. So sitting in my living room in California, typing away on my MacBook, writing this talk, I'm picturing you. I'm thinking about, what is it that you do? What are you interested in? And the talk that I write is interactive in expectation or anticipation of who's going to show up on a Saturday night. And what is it that they might be interested to hear? Think about the Inklings week after week, the same cluster of friends. And Lewis booming out, well, has nobody got anything to read us? And then out comes a chapter and round it goes with conversation. Now there's more. The Inklings also needed experts, right? You need people who have certain levels of expertise that you do not. I am beyond thrilled that Adam Bradley is here tonight, videotaping our time together and helping to share our story with a much larger group. Because Adam Bradley is the finest videographer I know. And not only that, I learn from him constantly. All kinds of things that are too hard for me. Technical things, wires and switches, and the way he loves God and serves his family and picks himself up after hard times and tries again. I'm constantly learning from him and his expertise. I need it. Because there are so many things that he understands and I do not have a clue. It is true. Call me clueless. C.S. Lewis also needed experts. He wrote a book called The Problem of Pain. Are you familiar with it? When he wrote that book, he thought that one of the very important things for him to really deal with, frankly, was the stories of people who were in very difficult medical circumstances. So he ran every word of that book by one member of the Inklings, Dr. R.E. Havard, a medical doctor who was a member of the group. And Havard's advice was so helpful, Lewis, C.S. Lewis, you know C.S. Lewis? That C.S. Lewis invited Dr. Havard to write a chapter at the end of his book, The Problem of Pain. You check it out. One of the chapters in that book was written by Dr. R.E. Havard. He needed the expertise and the point of view and perspective that only Havard could bring. The Inklings also need those of us who will carry on their legacy, who will catch the vision and continue to resonate and bounce it forward, keeping the story alive. They needed people who would expand their stories, adding music to it, capturing it on film, translating the story into new art forms, allowing the vision to take on a life of its own, which is what every artist wants. Right? It gets too big, it leaves the nest, it goes on, and it has a life independent of anything we ever dreamed of it. There are so many different and essential roles that we can play as we come alongside in the process of creation and help one another find our calling and live it out day by day. I started this talk tonight by asking a question. What was the secret of the great things that Lewis and Tolkien accomplished in their lifetime? I am persuaded that the one thing that really made all the difference is that they had each other. The Inklings were resonators, they were agitators. They gave each other the gift of eager anticipation. They lavished one another with gifts of encouragement. In Christian terms, we could say they bore one another's burdens. They carried one another's load. They became who they were as individuals by devoting themselves to one another, listening carefully to one another and guarding one another's dreams. The bottom line is this, that rather than devoting themselves to becoming the best they could be, the Inklings worked tirelessly for decades to learn how to bring out the best in each other. Now, when it comes to the importance of community, nobody expresses the idea better than Tolkien. But I think I may have found a tribute to the Inklings in an unlikely place. A trace of Narnia in the heart of Middle-earth. A part of the story that reflects Tolkien's deep appreciation for the part that Lewis and the other Inklings played as necessary friends who sustained his creative life. In The Lord of the Rings, you have a great fellowship, right? Drawn from different places with different backgrounds. Elves, dwarves, hobbits, wizards, as different can be, with good reason to be hostile and suspicious of one another. You've noticed, I think, in the Chronicles of Narnia, you don't have a singular superhero, but you have clusters of children. You have fellowships at work, drawn from different races and cultures, coming together to fight a common enemy. These fellowships band together to fight the gloom of their present age. We need to do the same. Well, you remember the story in The Lord of the Rings. Frodo has accepted the challenge of taking the Ring of Power to Mount Doom in order to destroy it and save Middle-earth. His friend, Sam, has traveled with him every step of the way. As they get near the end of their journey, Frodo is finding it harder and harder and harder to continue. Sam offers to carry the ring for him, but Frodo tells him that that is not possible, that each of us has a burden that only he can bear. And this is what happens in the story. Now for it. Now for the last gasp, said Sam, as he struggled to his feet. He bent over Frodo. Frodo groaned, but with a great effort of will, he staggered up. But then he fell on his knees again. He raised his eyes with difficulty to the dark slopes of Mount Doom towering above him. And then pitifully, he began to crawl forward on his hands. Sam looked at him and wept in his heart, but no tears came to his dry and stinging eyes. I said I'd carry him if it broke my back, he muttered, and I will. Come, Mr. Frodo, he cried. I can't carry that ring for you, but I can carry you, and it is well. So up you get. Come on, Mr. Frodo. Sam will give you a ride. Just tell me where to go, and we'll go. As Frodo clung upon his back, arms loosely about his neck, legs clasped firmly under his arms, Sam staggered to his feet. And then to his amazement, he felt his burden light. He had feared that he would have barely the strength to lift his master alone, and beyond that, he had expected to share in the dreadful, dragging weight of the accursed ring. But it was not so. Whether because Frodo was so worn by his long pains, wound of knife and venomous sting, and sorrow, fear, and homeless wandering, or because some gift of final strength was given to him, Sam lifted Frodo with no more difficulty than if he were carrying a hobbit child piggyback in some romp on the lawns or the hayfields of the Shire. He took a deep breath, and they started off. What Sam discovers is that when he focuses all of his energy and effort and attention on trying to bear his own burden, it's dreadful. It's more than he can bear. But when Sam turns his attention to others, when he focuses on the needs of others, he finds that all of a sudden his own burden is surprisingly light. Loved ones, it's a deeply spiritual principle to bear one another's burdens. And it's a deeply practical one, too. Because when we connect with one another and we practice these things, we do better work despite our heavy loads and competing demands. We persevere through hard times and doubts in the shadow of Mount Doom. We persevere. We're more productive. We accomplish so much more. And I think, honestly, if we learn to get really good at this, the whole thing just becomes a little bit easier, too. Because no matter how great our talents, I think we all live into those talents and come fully alive when we have a little help from our friends. Thank you.